Good evening, and welcome to Physical Science 1000, Week 3. In Week 3, we're going to be looking at Chapters 4 and the beginning of Chapter 5, which deal with the subjects of populations, communities, and ecosystems. Chapter 4 in particular is one of my favorites because it deals with the issue of how ecosystems respond and evolve to changing pressures on the ecosystem. We're going to be looking first at how they do this naturally, that is, how they respond and change with regard to evolutionary pressures and as with regard to changes in the world ecosystems over the many millennia, if you will, that the planet has been in existence. But more importantly, by understanding how ecosystems naturally evolve and respond to stress, we're going to be able to better understand how ecosystems are currently responding to the stress that humanity is placing on them just by virtue of the number of the people we have in the world now and how we're using up our ecosystem capital. So understanding how they have evolved in the past will help us to understand how to preserve them in the current and protect them into the future. Chapter 4 then begins with the topic of the dynamics of natural populations. We'll see that populations of different species within an ecosystem have different ways that they can respond to pressures on those ecosystems. In a well-balanced, equilibrated ecosystem, we would have a population which begins with a small number of individuals, and then as time goes by, the individuals multiply, and you have an accelerating growth curve of those individuals within the ecosystem. And then at some point, the number of individuals begin to reach what we call the carrying capacity. This is the level of ecosystem resources that can be provided to that number of individuals. That is, it determines the maximum number of individuals that can be sustainably supported by the ecosystem. And at that point, in a healthy ecosystem, the population will level off and continue on indefinitely, using up the ecosystem resources in a rate that does not exceed the ability of the ecosystem to replace them. This will be contrasted to what happens to a population which increases but never really levels off. It just continues to accelerate well beyond the carrying capacity of that ecosystem. And in going past the carrying capacity, the individual population is using up all the resources of the ecosystem faster than the ecosystem can resupply them. And in a situation like that, we have the imminent threat, like on Easter Island, of causing the extinction of that population. And as in the case of Easter Island, if we look at this J-curve, as it's called, we'll see that this J-curve has many of the characteristics of the human growth curve that we saw in the last chapter. And while we hope that the human growth curve will eventually level off at the carrying capacity, we don't see that happening yet. So what we have now is a J-curve representing human population that could lead to potential extinction, or hopefully the leveling off of this J-curve to make it more like an S-curve so that we will learn to live within our sustainable supply of resources. We'll see that populations are limited within an ecosystem due to what we call environmental resistance. Environmental resistance are all those things that act against increasing populations of individuals. Things like limitations on the amount of food or nutrients that are available to the individuals within the population. Other necessary things such as water, habitat, weather, the presence of other predators, disease. All of these things act to keep down the amount of population that is being produced in an ecosystem. We'll see this is counteracted by what we call the biotic potential. Biotic potential is the ability of the species within an ecosystem to reproduce themselves. We'll see that different types of species have different kinds of strategies for raising their young and getting them to maturity. So the combination of the ability of species to reproduce themselves and protect themselves until they reach the age of reproduction so they can continue the species versus the amount of environmental resistance to that biotic potential is what determines the ultimate level of individuals within that ecosystem, the population density. We're going to see how different individuals within an ecosystem interact with each other in ways that are both supportive and non-supportive. We're going to look at something, we're going to look at species sometimes referred to as keystone species. Species like the starfish indicated in this figure here, which serve a vital role within the ecosystem. In fact, such a vital role in their particular ecosystem that if they were to be eliminated from the ecosystem, the entire ecosystem could collapse. And because of their key role in the ecosystem, they're called keystone species. And we'll look at how different species play the role of being a keystone species and some examples of some important keystone species in different kinds of environmental habitats. We're going to look at how, not only how ecosystems evolve, if you will, but how species within an ecosystem will evolve as a result of pressures brought about them due to evolution, as well as abiotic factors such as temperature, water, predators, and other things of that nature. Of course, the key example of forces for change is the theory of evolution itself, proposed by Darwin. And in fact, we're going to look a little at some of his original work with a species of birds called finches that were found on the Galapagos Islands in the South Pacific. And we're going to see how different species of these finches evolved different characteristics that allowed them to better survive within their different ecosystems and allowed them to better compete for food and as a result have a better opportunity to succeed and pass their genes on to the next generation. Next, we're going to look at the implications of changing ecosystems for human management and what has happened when species are introduced into a well-balanced ecosystem that have not evolved as part of that ecosystem and become in balance with that ecosystem. A good example would be what happened when rabbits were introduced into Australia. Rabbits had no evolved predators on Australia, and consequently when they were introduced to that continent, they grew wild because there were no limitations on their numbers. And as they grew wild and there was no limitation or predation of the rabbits eventually used up the vegetation that was in various parts of Australia, ate it all the way down to the ground. And as you recall, this is a very bad situation. Again, as like happened with Easter Island, if all the vegetation is removed from a habitat, then the soil begins eroding away and soon there is no soil from which vegetation can grow. But as we will also see, once the problem was understood and the rabbits were removed from the ecosystem and the ecosystem was allowed to rebalance itself, the land in Australia was able to replenish itself and come back and restore the natural balance to the ecosystem that was there to begin with. This is the kind of good news type scenario that we're hoping to be able to do on a vast scale throughout the world as we begin to understand the destruction that we may be causing inadvertently or even on purpose in some cases to our environment, and learning what we need to do to correct those actions so that we can repair and replenish the environment for now and into the future. Next, we're going to look at the characteristics of ecosystems, the characteristics that help make them function, and the flow of energy within ecosystems. And as we'll see, there are various levels of participants, if you will, within the ecosystem that all contribute to the overall function of the ecosystem. We've already talked about green plants and their ability to convert sunlight and carbon dioxide and water into organic material. And these then are called the autotrophs or producers because they can take sunlight and directly convert it into food. This food then is eaten by other animals, the herbivores within an ecosystem, and they become what we call the first level of consumer. So we have herbivores feeding upon the green plants. But then, of course, just as they feed upon the plants, they are fed upon themselves by predators, the second level of consumer in many ecosystems. These typically are carnivores and also omnivores, which both eat meat and can eat plants, man being a good example of an omnivore. And then there's what we call a third level of consumer that can feed upon the carnivores themselves. So things like predatory birds that feed upon small rodents and things that in turn feed upon plants. So we have several different levels within an ecosystem of feeders, if you will, starting with those that feed upon the producers and those that feed upon the feeders. And we'll see that as we go up this hierarchy of feeding, if you will, there are different factors that come into play as to how those different levels operate and what they need in order to continue functioning in a correct way. We'll also look at how energy flows from the very basic producers up through these different levels and the amount of energy in terms of food energy that are lost as you go up from each level of within the ecosystem, from the producers all the way up to the various consumers. We're going to look at what the implications on that is in terms of being able to stretch the resources that are being produced by these ecosystems. And then finally, we're going to look at what happens when an ecosystem is suddenly and in some cases drastically disturbed, such as what might occur in a forest fire, where a fire literally wipes out an entire forest ecosystem. How does an ecosystem come back from such a catastrophic change to the way it has been operating in the past? And as we'll see, nature has designed some very interesting and unique mechanisms for dealing with that particular problem and the different ways in which, again, ecosystems can reestablish themselves, sometimes to reestablish themselves back into the kind of ecosystem they were before the dramatic disturbance, or because of the dramatic disturbance, an opportunity is presented for new individuals to come into that ecosystem and establish themselves, whereas before they couldn't because of the fact that they were competed against by the already established individuals within the ecosystem. So a major disturbance then can provide an opportunity for a new type of ecosystem to evolve that will have some of the parameters of the original ones, but perhaps some new parameters that will change this ecosystems in ways that will make it somewhat different and perhaps somewhat better than the one that was originally there. All right, so this then will take us through the first few parts of Chapter 5, which is all I really intend for you to read as part of this module. But I hope that you will read it with interest. I hope that you will find, as I did, many interesting stories and illustrations, particularly within the chapter, to illustrate how ecosystems function, how amazingly sophisticated and complex they are, but in some ways how simple they are, and the kind of lessons that they can provide us for helping to preserve them and to assure their continuing existence into the future so that they continue to provide the resources and eco-capital we need to survive as a human species.